Okay, well, it's 9:01, so it's officially uh, the time. So let's get started. My name is Samuel Farhi. I'm the lead instructional designer at EdApp, also the founder, co-founder of TrainOn, our LinkedIn group, and you might have heard about this webinar through that. Um, TrainOn is a group where instructional designers, people in learning, the L&D industry, meet with people who are not in the L&D industry and not instructional designers and can ask them questions. And so it's a really, really great resource. And if you have any questions about any of the courses that you're creating, or you want to get even feedback on something you're creating, it's a really great forum to do that. I'll just show you what it looks like here. I'll share my screen. So here it is. This is the TrainOn group page. It's just TrainOn powered by EdApp. We have 1,700 members now, which is pretty incredible. Because we're not that old. We're actually pretty young. And so come on down and join. We'd love to have you. And yeah, it'd be great. So not only do we have posts from IDs asking questions or people asking questions of IDs, we also have workshops where we partner with nonprofit groups and create courseware for them. So it's an opportunity for aspiring instructional designers to learn from more senior instructional designers, but also to produce something, one, for their portfolio, but even more importantly, for a greater good. And those are called the TrainOn workshops. So stay tuned to TrainOn. We're about to do another round of that for two groups. And if you'd like, and the sign up is past due, but because you came to the webinar, if you want to message me directly and see if we can still get you in, feel free to do that. Okay, great. So what we're going to be talking about today is basically what's called scenario-based learning, and what that is, why is it important for adult learners, and also some tips and how to do it yourself. So just real basic scenario-based learning is when there's a scenario given or a story, and the learner responds and how they would act in that situation or how someone else should act in that situation, but it's really story-based. Okay, so the reason why we have scenarios in our training, or why it's a good idea to have it, is because it creates an authentic experience for your learners. So what we do know about adult learners is that a requirement for them to learn anything really is to have practical application, and not anything, but anything related to the job. It needs to be practical. It needs to relate to how it's going to help in their daily work. It's going to need to be concrete, and scenarios are a really great way to do that. Okay, and we'll go over how to do it and why to do that in a moment. But one of the things that's really important in creating a scenario is being authentic to the workplace that you're creating it for. So today, I'm sure our audience is going to be a little bit of a mix. There's going to be some IDs that are from either TrainOn or have heard about EdApp or want to hear more about scenario-based learning. But there's also going to be people in the group today that are taking the reins of the learning and development of their company. They might not necessarily have an ID background, but they were given that ID task. Okay, so there's going to be a mix in our audience today. So, but there's something that those folks have that's a little bit in a really kind of a more advantageous position than even an ID is, where an ID is, because if you are that one person L&D department in your company, you are very familiar with the day-to-day of what you're doing or what the workers are doing, your employees are doing, your coworkers. Those things that they're doing and implementing those into the learning is so, so important. You actually have a leg up on the IDs, because if an ID comes into a company, they don't know the day-to-day, they don't know the processes of how things work, and they don't know what it's like on the ground. So for the IDs that don't know what it's like on the ground, that's where your what's called a subject matter expert comes in. And interviewing a subject matter expert is a whole different webinar, because there's so many, there's an art to the interview and that kind of conversation. So that would be a different webinar. If you do not know what's going on in the day-to-day life of the learner that you're creating for, and you don't have access to an SME, what we've done is, let's say we were making content for our course library, and there's security guard content. Well, we didn't let's say that day we didn't have access to a subject matter expert. We just Googled security guard day-to-day life, and we looked at Reddit, and we looked at these different sources, and we saw what it's really like to be a security guard. So there's little tricks that you can do like that, and that could also be another webinar. Okay. One of the biggest reasons why, hold on, I'm gonna pin my video here. Okay. One of the biggest reasons to do scenario-based learning is that it creates an environment where people can make mistakes and there are not any real consequences to it. So if there's, let's say, a safety policy or a way to do a process that's safer, doing it in a module first and having somebody pick the wrong answer, there aren't the consequences that could happen if we're out on the ground and someone makes the wrong decision, where there actually can be real consequences. So it gives our learners room to make the wrong choice without having real consequences to that. And that's really, really important. And that's a big part of the scenario-based whole reason why we put real scenarios in training. Yeah, so how do we do that? And we're going to go into some examples in a second. But another thing that is really important with adult learners is that if we're learning all these kind of things that are on the job, let's just call them abstract things on the job, and there's no practical application, or they can't right away see the practical application, the scenario is going to merge those two things. So if, let's say this is it for a salesperson, and there's the abstract concept of be nice to the person that you're talking to. I'm just making that up, but let's say it's be nice to the person you're talking to. And they don't see how that works. It's going to be just much harder to actually get someone to perform in the way that the training is asking them to. So if it's saying something like, be nice to the client, how would you do that? As an open-ended question, people could have a million different answers. If it was something like, a client comes into the office, it was raining outside, they're completely drenched, what do you do before bringing them into the meeting room? That's a real life scenario, and you're applying the be nice kind of abstraction to that real life scenario. Do you take their coat? Do you offer them water? Do you greet them? Do you perhaps talk about the weather before talking about business? All of those things could be in that real life scenario. Okay, great. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to, yeah, so I'm going to share here. I'm going to go into EdApp. So obviously I'm the lead instructional designer at EdApp. So we're going to be looking at EdApp as the authoring tool today. So I'm just going to share here and go to EdApp. I want to give you just a few examples and maybe an example that we can look at throughout this webinar. So first, I'm going to create a course. Let's call our course Scenario-Based Learning. And for those who are not familiar, this is the EdApp authoring tool. We have courses and lessons live within courses. You click create a course, you type in the title, and it creates a course automatically. If I click create a lesson, it'll create the lesson that we're working with. So I'm going to call this lesson, I'm going to use my character, Danny. You know what? Let's call this, it's because my example is about cleaning up a restaurant. So I'm just going to say cleaning up the restaurant. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to go into the authoring tool. I click on edit content. And here I am in the authoring tool. Now, just a real quick, 2 seconds about the authoring tool so you know what you're looking at here. EdApp is an authoring tool that's template based. So the left here is your preview. The right is your pile of templates. And the middle is where you're doing all the typing and images. So in real basic terms, it's fill in the blank. So you click on add a new slide, you click on any of these templates and you can fill in the blank. So there's a default image, you take it out, you put in your own image. Or here's some text, you change the text and it changes on the left side. So that's really the quickest way just to show you the authoring tool. Okay, I'm going to delete this. I'm going to make the background black and white or white and black just because it's easier that way. I prefer that. It'll go with what we're going with. Okay, so I just clicked on theme. I changed the color scheme, press save changes, and now the whole lesson looks like that. Okay, now we're ready to go. So okay, so let me give you just an example of what I mean when I talk about scenario-based questions or scenario-based learning versus learning without scenarios. So if I have, let's say, a multiple choice question, I'm going to go to multiple choice, click here, and I have the question, what can happen if we don't dry the floors at the end of the night? There's kind of a scenario here, but it's missing some key elements, okay? If I did the same thing, I'm actually going to just duplicate this. Here, so this is without story elements. This is just a kind of a situation. But if we have a story, which scenario is another word really for story, we could do this. This is what it would look like. I would say something like, Danny has had a late night. Customers stayed after the restaurant was closed. And he has just mopped the floors. He wants to go home and leave the floors wet. What are some consequences of this? Now it's a little bit more text, obviously, but here's a real scenario. And it's asking the learner to not just say, what would you do in this situation? It's not putting the onus on the learner themselves. It's creating distance. It's saying, okay, here's someone named Danny. Okay, has this late night, these are the circumstances, it's even past his working hours, maybe this is getting into overtime, he wants to leave it wet because the floors, yeah, they'll dry. What are some of the consequences of this, right? And so this is not only is it giving some distance, so it's not just, management asking the learner, what would you do in this situation? You're right, or you're wrong, or you should do it like this. It takes that away because we're talking about the fictional Danny. Okay, so giving that distance allows for that really important thing to happen in scenario-based learning, which is the ability to make mistakes without consequences. Because if you get this question wrong, you're not getting, reprimanded for that. You might not get the best score on the module, but in real life, you're not getting, demoted or, your hours cut or even fired if you leave the floors wet here. Here's just a hypothetical, okay? So it's really, really important to kind of create that distance. And it may not look like a huge difference between this and this, but there are some key elements about this that do a lot for us. So in a story, for example, we're going to go over these key elements. So in a story, for example, there's always a beginning, middle, and end to a story. When you have scenario-based learning, it's a little bit different, okay? Because we're not giving the end of the story. We are giving the beginning and the middle and asking the learner to decide the end. So that's a big, big part of it. So the beginning is this part of the question. Danny is the beginning. He's our main character. The situation is the middle. That's the customer stayed after the restaurant was closed. He wants to leave it wet. The end is, what are the consequences of leaving the floor wet? And the learner is deciding what that end is. So this is an example of a self-contained scenario that's in one slide. It's not throughout the entire lesson, it's in one slide. And it asks the learner to really think about the consequences of that instead of what this question is doing, where they're really just going, okay, yeah, you're not supposed to do it. I'll just pick the worst answers here. Here, they're really thinking about what are the consequences of that and why do we do the things that we do? Why do we dry the floors at the end of the night, even though they'll be dry by the next morning? Why do we do these things? And having the why question answered grounds the learner in making decisions in the real world, because they're going, oh, this is why we do this. So this is why it's important that I do this, but it's also going to help me make decisions later. Let's say if it's not about that particular floor, this particular situation, but some of the why this situation applies to that. Like, let's say, it's not a floor that's wet. It's a apron that's wet and left out. Well, some of the why might transfer from this situation to that situation. So they're going to be more grounded in making decisions that are outside of this scenario because they're thinking about that why. So there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on here. But the real key just to take away from this is you want a character, you want a situation, and you want your learner to pick the ending of that situation. Now, in terms of this question that's here, what are some of the consequences of this? Most of these questions, when you have a scenario, and here's another kind of tip. We're just going to kind of upbold these tips for you guys. The second tip is to have your questions be what and how questions. What and how questions. Okay, so what are some of the consequences of this? Is not, why is this a bad thing to do? What are some of the consequences of this? Allows for the learner to think of their own whys for things. But really, for scenario-based learning, what and how questions are going to be your best bet. Okay. Another thing that we're doing here is that the character here is a third person. So Danny is someone who's not the learner themselves. So the learner feels free to go, oh, well, this is what that person did wrong. It's a lot easier to say to your boss than here's what I did wrong most of the time. Okay, so this question could be worded in, you had a late night, customer stayed after, you want to go home, but you want to leave the floors wet. But it sounds accusatory, first of all, and it might not be the character of the person that's reading it. So instead of doing, you did this and you're in this situation, having that name, Danny, makes a whole different scenario here, or a different relationship to the scenario. Okay. I use the name Danny. I wouldn't use your employees or coworkers' names in the question. I would try to think of a name, outside of who's taking it. For many reasons, Danny's a friend of mine that doesn't work with me, so I just took his name and put it here. That's a way to do it, or just Google random names. That could work as well. Okay. Another thing that we're doing is that this scenario is very short. In traditional instructional design, where it's opposed to what we're doing, which is microlearning. Like if you had a module that was 45 minutes long or an hour long, you had to take it every quarter. In traditional instructional design, it's a very popular trend to have a character that goes throughout that 45 minutes, an hour, and you're helping guide that character through different problems and things like that throughout that module. Now, for microlearning, that doesn't work really as well because we have lessons that are between 9 and 12 slides, let's say, and our learners might not be taking them all at once. They might be taking them for 5 minutes one day, 5 minutes 2 days later. So having that long form story isn't as helpful as it could be somewhere else. Personally, I never really connected with that character and those kind of older in the modules that I've taken as an employee, where there's a long story arc. It requires a lot. Personally, I just never, I don't prefer them. Now, this scenario is on one slide. It's self-contained. If I pick it up 2 days later, the next lesson, I don't need to know who Danny is or what happened with Danny to complete that lesson. So that's why in microlearning, it's important to have it be self-contained and live on a slide or two. Okay. Another thing that what I would say is in kind of longer form instructional design that worked really well was that you'd have the character, and the character would be an illustration, and it would go into different situations. Or if you were really fancy and could afford a photographer, and you would use maybe pictures of that person going through the different steps or different scenarios. But if you do not have that resource, it's a lot easier to work with a self-contained scenario in the slide or two, because you don't need to have that image of Danny washing dishes and that same Danny serving plates and that same Danny cleaning up at the end of the night. That's tough to get. So it's another reason I suggest short. Another thing that I suggest with microlearning, because you don't have the burden of having to have that character throughout a lesson, I prefer photos for a few reasons. And this obviously all depends on your audience, whether it's illustrations or photos that you're using for these characters. I personally prefer photos because I find them relatable. It allows for more diversity of characters and the kind of people that are in the organization. And it gives it's just a little less childlike. No diss to illustrations. I just prefer photos. Now, for EdApp, it's really easy to have a photo on something. So if I wanted to add a photo to this multiple choice template, I can select all here for my question and scenario. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to put it in the subtitle field. And up here, there are all these different boxes. So for the multiple choice template, I can add a photo by clicking on this image box. And then my Canva integration comes up. So if I click on design on Canva, I click on photos, say I'm going to type in mopping. I could have this photo. I could have this photo. There's many photos I could choose from. I think I'll just choose maybe this one. Or this is in a restaurant. We'll do this one. Keep it simple. This. Publish. And so there are a lot of benefits to using photos. It makes it a relatable situation. I probably could have found an even better photo than this, but just to show you how to do it in EdApp, using that Canva integration and then clicking on photos, you have a huge selection of stock photos. And there's so many different things you could type in here. If I type in, let's say restaurant mopping, I'm sure something will come up. Yeah, here's someone mopping in a restaurant. This actually probably would be a better one. Let's do that. So you just drag it. I might not put his face in. I might just have the person like this. That actually looks fine. You can imagine who Danny is this way. And here we are. Very simple. Some other good EdApp templates to use when you're doing scenario-based learning is this one is great because you have your scenario and your question, your answers, and you have a photo at the top. There's also an option for a video at the top. You can have a small clip if you'd like. You can even have the scenario in the clip if you'd like, and you could save some text space. There's also a place you can put YouTube links or Vimeo, and you can embed a video there as well from YouTube, or even have an audio. So there's a lot of creative, awesome things you can do within the template here for multiple choice. Another good thing you can do is pairing, let's say, an image gallery with your question. So let's say I have this question in this scenario. Maybe I don't want all this text here. I could take this. I could put it on my image gallery. I have more room now for my image of Danny. Let's see. It could be a whole different thing here. Let's do this and publish. And so by sequencing the image gallery before the multiple choice, I can introduce the character. Danny's had a late night, customer stayed after. And the next slide can be what are the consequences Danny will face or something like that. But basically you can pair these two together and the scenario lives in those two slides. Another great one is just having a video slide is always good. Let's say those are going to be in your content templates. All the way at the bottom, you have your video slide, you have your Vimeo or YouTube video slides here. If you have a longer scenario, this is the one to use, scrolling media. And why scrolling media is so great is because first you can put in a lot of text in it and it doesn't feel too long. You can actually scroll through it. So if this was on a mobile phone, you could scroll up and go through the scenario. It's also super agile. I can put an image here. I can add a section with an image. I can add a section with text, add some text, and then have a section with video. And that can all be on the same slide, right? And you can see that it scrolls up and down. So this is a really great template to do it. And what I would do is have maybe a text section at the end that says, in the next 3 slides, answer a question. You'll answer questions based on this scenario, something like that, to kind of transition from this slide to the next, but also to let them go, okay, I'm going to take some time out of the scenario and then answer the questions in the next few templates. Okay, so those are all good templates to use. Okay, so I've been talking a lot, but I do want to hear some questions from you guys. So let's see what we have here. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Okay. Okay, in case where you're using using video to explain a concept or skill followed by multiple choice tests, do you have any guidance in terms of how long the video should be or not exceed? Okay, I'm going to answer this live. Yeah, so the probably under a minute is good. Under a minute is good. If it's longer than a minute, I like to prep the learners and maybe a slide before and say, hey, check out this 2-minute video that's coming up. We'll have answer questions about it. Just because in the microlearning in mobile based learning, we could be on the bus on the way to work and a video pop up, or I might need a second to put in my headphones to do so, or I might not have 2 minutes of video watching time. So it's good to prep your learners that that's coming. But I would say under 1 minute is ideal. I wouldn't put over 2 minutes usually. And if it is over 2 minutes, maybe splitting it and using a video editor and having a couple different slides. Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, next question, what about branching scenarios in EdApp? I'm going to answer this live. So EdApp is a micro-learning, mobile-first authoring tool. And because of that, we can be creative in creating branching scenarios. We can have different lessons within a course and have different prereqs for them, which gives something like a branching scenario. But at the moment, the authoring tool is pretty linear on purpose, so that it's short and is easy to create. So at the moment, we don't have branching scenarios don't have branch scenarios, but there are workarounds to create a kind of like a branching scenario. Like, let's say you have a lesson and you had a certain score in that lesson, another lesson would unlock. That's like kind of the closest thing we have at the moment. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I just want to give a quick recap of some of these tips here. Basically, what and how questions for your scenarios are going to be really, really important. Your scenario should have a character that's not the learner, a situation, and the learner chooses the ending of that story. So beginning, middle, and end is character, situation, and the learner chooses that end. Okay. And keep it short in microlearning. And I would use photos. And I think those are the big tips. Image gallery is a great template. Multiple choice template is a great one if you want to use images and video in conjunction with the question. Actually, let me just show you where that particular slide is. I just want to make sure you really get that one, because we have many multiple choice templates. And the reason being is that we believe in having a diversity of templates in a lesson. To not repeat the same template more than once in a lesson is always our goal, as the IDs here. But this multiple choice, this one or this one. So this row where it just says multiple choice, it's not circled answer, chat, categorize, carousels, none of those. It's just multiple choice. And this is going to be able to allow you to have a video at the top, or audio, or an image, and then a question underneath. Okay, so these three, that should work for you. Okay. Also, combining with maybe scrolling media image gallery with a multiple choice question, in which case you can use any of these other ones. I think chat is a scenario based multiple choice template. The customer asks this, what is your answer? Now we could change this around. We could say, what's Danny's answer? We could make it more third person and probably more easier to answer in this way without feeling like, oh, I have to, I could get in trouble for answering this wrong. So yeah, the chat one is great. Yeah, so these are all really great. Okay, any other last questions? Let me stop sharing. We have another couple questions here. Okay. How much knowledge transfer is recommended prior to the scenario? Would you do that in lessons prior to the scenario lesson? I would do it in the same lesson for that's because I think very micro and very short chunks. I think it is necessary before the scenario happens for my style usually, because I don't like to have a learner go into a question without having the knowledge to answer it. I think that can get frustrating for somebody if I'm asking questions about stuff they haven't learned yet. But what I think is important is having knowledge transfer first, maybe a different kind of knowledge transfer before the scenario, asking about the first knowledge transfer. Does that make sense? So in EdApp, let's say you're working with very few amount of slides for a lesson. What I do is content slide A, content slide B, question about content slide A. And so there's a little bit of a buffer between the question and the content. And then I kind of repeat that pattern throughout. And so having questions throughout, keeping it interactive throughout, I think is very important for the work we do, just because we don't want it to feel like a test at the end. We do want to have interactions throughout a lesson. So this would be a good way to do that. Thanks. Thank you for that, Chris. Okay, what about feedback when the learner selects one option? I think this is important, right? Yeah, so we do have feedback fields for if they select an incorrect or correct option. Those are customizable. So if they say the wrong thing, you can have a different message that gets to them than if they say the correct thing. So that is possible in every interaction slide in that app. Okay. Okay, feedback and show, don't tell for, yes. Okay, and one of my quandaries is video. Do we look for mobile style, which looks okay on PC, or PC, which can look okay on mobile? It's a good question. I think for video, when it's on mobile, it can look high quality, even at 360p. So, on YouTube, when it has the video quality, like wheel, and you click on it and it has ultra high def and high def. So 1080, 720, 480, et cetera, et cetera. That 720 and 1080p, that's for your television. That's for like huge big screen TV to look like a movie theater. You don't need that when doing this stuff, and it eats up too much space, I would say. So I recommend the low quality is going to look high quality just because you're on such a small screen with mobile. So I think maybe 480p, something around that would be more than enough. Okay. And do we look for mobile style, which looks okay in PC, or PC is okay in mobile? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but I would go for the wider video landscape. Okay. All right, great. You can click done on all these. Should we use mobile first style? I think yes. I mean, that's what I do. But I think usually what I do is the mobile first style. Okay, I understand there's a large UX update coming for the student view within EdApp. Any updates as to when this is scheduled for? Loads of great updates happening to EdApp at the moment. Any recommendations for how to stay abreast of developments and updates? Bobby might be better to answer that one than me.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you just repeat that question again, Sam?
Yeah, so Shane says, I understand there's been a large UX update for the student view within EdApp. Any update as to when that's scheduled for? And there are loads of great updates happening to EdApp at the moment. Any recommendations for how to stay abreast of developments and updates?
Sure, yeah. So I believe that on desktop, the new Learners experience should be coming out soon. I don't think they have a release date yet, but it probably will be within the next couple of weeks. And then after, it will be released on the apps at some point after that. To stay abreast on what's going on, I know a lot of the account managers now are sending out bi-weekly emails for those of you that are in the US, or I think it's called fortnightly if you're based in the UK, of product updates of what's come out and what's coming out soon. And I would also make sure that you're signed up for marketing emails, because for some of the bigger features that we have, they also do release. They also send out an email on the bigger releases that we have. So observations is a big new feature coming out soon. So I believe that there'll be a marketing email on that. But if you're not an enterprise customer, I would email, and I'll put this in the chat. If you can email support@edapp.com, depending on what region you're in, we can get you added to perhaps an AM in your region, and they can send you, those emails every other week. So that's what I'd recommend. Thanks, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Bobby. Okay, it looks like we're about out of time. I want to just take this last couple minutes just to recommend joining TrainOn. It's just a huge resource. There's 1,700 people in there. A lot of them are L&D folks, ID folks that want to answer your questions and get to know you and things like that. So TrainOn on LinkedIn, you can type in TrainOn, all one word, and find us, and I will accept your invite, of course. So please, yeah, join. And thank you so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.